All right, Nehemiah 11, let's call this one We Offered to Live, because this is a chapter where it's going to say that 1 out of every 10 of the general population of men willingly offered to live in Jerusalem, as this is going to describe the way in which the leaders lived in Jerusalem. As we mentioned, the 1 out of every 10 men selected by lot agreed to live in Jerusalem. And it's also going to give us the names of the priests and the Levites who offered to live in Jerusalem. And so even though this is going to be another chapter filled with names, a couple of things caught my attention. First and foremost, as we've already mentioned the title, they offered to live in Jerusalem, and they were blessed by the people because of it, because they had inheritances, places where they could have otherwise lived by the genealogies we've seen in previous chapters, but they were sacrificing to live in Jerusalem, quite possibly because Israel's relationship with its neighbors was still on shaky ground, understanding that by the time we get to Nehemiah 13, Nehemiah's going to have to evict somebody out of the temple chambers. And so we still don't understand how the people are relating to Jerusalem, understanding that they seem to be getting along well enough with their neighbors dispersed throughout the territory, but there's something about Jerusalem rebuilding that caused the people to get upset, understanding they'd been free from the presence of the people of Israel for 70 years. Now that the returning exiles had begun to rebuild Jerusalem, one of the things we've seen throughout Ezra and Nehemiah is that every time they made progress in Jerusalem, that seemed to upset the people of the land. And so at least one other thing that caught my attention was that the 1 out of 10 or 10% of the men called to live in Jerusalem were all described as valiant men, and not just them, but the priests who were described as living in Jerusalem were described as valiant men as well, understanding that just as representatives of the people were called to live in Jerusalem, quite possibly because they were still not completely secure in Jerusalem from the people of the land, likewise, the priests and Levites, even though their duties were typically associated with work around the temple, they had representatives, even from the foundation of the nation, out amongst the people, understanding that they were central to the functioning of Israel's smaller courts. And so it was almost like a senate of people who were called in from amongst the people to serve in Jerusalem, and likewise a representation from the judiciary or the Levitical priesthood was called to represent the priesthood out amongst the people. But the thing that might have stood out to me more than any other fact was with regard to those valiant men. They reminded me of a village I got a chance to spend some time with in Africa, understanding that these men are described as making a great sacrifice, living away from their homes and the best of their property to serve in Jerusalem. I got the chance to spend time in a village where the chief had left his role as chief to be an elder in the church at that village. And so he sacrificed the authority he had over the entire village to serve in the village church. And even though I didn't get to know him in his time as village chief, I did get to see him function as elder. And the interesting thing about his leadership style was the way in which he built in healthy redundancy into the church, something we mentioned in our Wednesday night class last night, understanding that that term redundancy has one sense, especially over in England or the UK, where it suggests time for layoffs, meaning you're redundant because we got somebody else who can do your job. But in many healthy organizations, redundancy represents the way in which there are a number of people with the kind of skill set that can make sure that the organization continues to function even if one person goes down, meaning that failure in a single part does not lead to immediate failure in the organization because they have healthy redundancy, multiple people who can step up. Sometimes, as we see in the sports sense, where they'll say if one person gets injured, it's next man up. And so that's often what distinguishes football dynasties, especially in college, from schools that are occasionally successful. It is because they keep a healthy redundancy in their roster to make sure that there's not a tremendous fall off from their starters to the people who are behind them on what we would call the depth chart. And so the reason why college football and the village might have reminded me of this chapter in Nehemiah is that in pulling 1 out of 10 valiant men from their towns and villages to serve in Jerusalem, they were not draining the talent necessary to defend their towns and villages if they had healthy redundancy. And so much like those college football powerhouses or that church in the village where I saw the chief developing healthy redundancy behind himself, going 2 or 3 men deep who had high character and high talent that was visible even through the language barrier, Likewise, even today, the difference between occasionally successful organizations and dynasties may come down to the way in which dynasties develop healthy redundancy, something similar to what Jesus will eventually call disciples.